Somebody got away with something on you this year. Not a stranger either. Statistically, it was someone whose name you'd defend in an argument. Here's the part that should actually bother you. You didn't miss it because you're careless. You missed it because your brain was built, on purpose by evolution, to believe first and check later. That's not a flaw. That's the operating system that let humans build marriages and companies and civilizations out of strangers who agreed to trust each other before they had proof. It's a beautiful piece of engineering. It's also a door somebody can walk through. And the research on this is almost insulting in how blunt it is. Across decades of studies, the average adult catches a lie at roughly the rate of a coin flip. 50-50. Not a skill. A guess dressed up as confidence. So here's what we're going to do instead of feeling bad about that number. We're going to take it apart. 16 mechanisms. The architecture of a fabricated story versus a real memory. What a face does in the quarter second before it composes itself. Why certain questions make an honest person pause and a dishonest person perform. And because half your exposure to deception now happens through a screen. What a text message gives away that a voice never could. One more thing before we start, and it matters more than any tactic in this book. None of this is about becoming someone who trusts no one. That person is exhausting to be around, and worse, easy to fool anyway, because suspicion clouds pattern recognition as badly as naivety does. The goal is narrower and harder. Become someone who is very difficult to deceive. Stay warm. Stay open. Just stop being an easy grade. Let's start with the first tell. The one hiding in plain sight in how a story is built. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The performance versus the memory. Ask a friend what they did last Saturday night, and you'll get one of two completely different products. One of them is a memory. The other is a press release. Here's the memory version. Saturday. Oh God, let me think. I thought I stayed in, actually. No, wait, that was Friday. Saturday, I went to that new place downtown with Marcus, the one near... Is it near the bookshop? Or the pharmacy? I genuinely don't remember. Anyway, the tacos were unreasonable. Oh, and we ran into your friend Dana on the way out, which was so random. Notice what that is. It's disorganized. It backtracks. It includes a detail, Dana on the way out, that does absolutely nothing for the story and got mentioned anyway. Because that's just what got filed next to the memory. Nobody plans to remember Dana. The brain just does it, the way it keeps the receipt for something you'll never return. Now here's the press release version. Saturday night, I went to a restaurant downtown with a friend. We got there around 8, had dinner, talked for a couple hours, headed home around 10:30. That's not a lie because it's false. It might be entirely true. But notice the shape of it. Clean. Chronological. Nothing wasted, nothing wandering, nothing that sounds like a person reaching into a drawer and pulling out whatever their hand happens to touch. It sounds like a summary written for someone else's convenience. And that's worth sitting with. Because most people, when they're constructing something instead of remembering it, unconsciously build it for an audience, even when there's no audience yet. I made this mistake for years before I understood the mechanism behind it. I used to think a good liar was someone who added convincing detail. Confident, specific, textured. I was optimizing for the wrong variable entirely. I was grading polish. I should have been grading the kind of detail, not whether it was there, but what it was doing. Here's the actual distinction, and once you have it, you can't unsee it. When someone is remembering, the details they hand you are organic. They're irrelevant to the plot, and that's exactly how you know they're real. Nobody's brain manufactures a detail with no job to do. The wobbly chair, the dog outside, the song that happened to be playing. None of it advances anything. It's just what got recorded alongside the main event, like static that came free with the signal. When someone is constructing, the details are functional. They exist to make the account feel more real, which means every single one of them is doing a job. The waiter had a blue apron. We sat by the window. I remember because the bill was exactly $42. Specific, yes. Convincing, often. But notice, every detail there is load-bearing. It's holding up the story. Nothing is just lying around uselessly the way real memory litters a room with things nobody asked for. Professional interrogators have a term for this split: organic detail versus constructed detail. It's one of the most quietly reliable signals in the entire field, and it works precisely because most people don't fabricate for texture. They fabricate for plausibility. And plausibility, by definition, only produces details that serve a purpose. Real memory doesn't care about serving a purpose. Real memory just leaks. There's a second layer to this that's even more useful, and it shows up under pressure. Ask someone an honest, unexpected question about something real, a detail from an angle they weren't braced for, and you'll watch them go looking for it. There's a pause. The eyes drift somewhere that isn't you because they're not performing right now. They're searching. Sometimes they find the answer. Sometimes they just say, "Honestly, I don't remember that part," and move on without any visible cost to saying it. Ask that same unexpected question to someone who's constructing, and something different happens because there's no drawer to search. There's only the structure they already built, and now they have to extend it in a direction they hadn't planned for. Watch closely, and you'll catch something that isn't quite searching. It's closer to calculation. A tiny shift in pace, a slight increase in the vagueness of the language, like someone buying half a second. Then the answer arrives, usually as either an extension of the rehearsed material or a smooth pivot that sounds like an answer without actually being one. This is the foundational shift I want you carrying into every conversation from here forward. Stop listening only to what someone says. Start listening to the architecture underneath it. Ask yourself, does this feel like a person reaching into something that actually happened to them? Or does this feel like a person reading from something they wrote? Maybe not on paper, but somewhere quieter in advance. Because here's what almost nobody tells you about lying convincingly. It's expensive. It requires drafting, editing, and rehearsal, even if all of that happens in under a second. Even if the person doing it doesn't consciously know they're doing it. And expensive things leave a trace. The trace isn't in what's said. It's in how effortlessly, or how carefully, it was assembled. Everything else we're about to cover builds on this one distinction. The body, the language, the emotional weather that rolls in right when your questions get too close. All of it is downstream of the same basic fact. Memory is retrieved. Fiction is built. And building, no matter how good you are at it, always shows up differently than remembering, if you know exactly where to look. Chapter 2. The baseline you never set. Here's a mistake almost everyone makes, and it's not the one you'd guess. It's not that people are too trusting. It's that people go looking for signs of lying without ever having established what that specific person looks like when they're telling the truth. Think about how absurd this actually is once you say it out loud. You watch someone avoid eye contact for 2 seconds and think, there it is, that's the tell. But you have no idea if this is a person who avoids eye contact when they're concentrating, or embarrassed, or just introverted and mildly uncomfortable being looked at while they talk, which, statistically, describes an enormous number of perfectly honest people. You clocked a deviation from a line you never actually drew. I watched this play out with a friend of mine years ago, someone I'd known maybe 6 months at the time. He got quiet and strange whenever anyone asked him direct questions about his family. Clipped answers, sudden subject changes, a kind of visible flinch. I filed it as a red flag. Something being hidden, something worth watching. It took almost a year for me to learn he'd lost a sibling young and simply never developed an easy way to talk about family without the ground shifting under him. There was nothing being hidden except grief. I had graded a deviation against a baseline I'd invented, not one I'd actually observed. This is the piece almost nobody teaches, and it's the reason so many people become worse lie detectors the more tips they collect. They start pattern matching against a universal template. Crossed arms means defensive. Looking away means dishonest. Pauses mean deception, instead of building a baseline for the actual human being in front of them. And universal templates are close to useless because human beings are not universal. Some people gesture constantly when they're relaxed and go still when they're anxious. Some people do the exact opposite. Some people talk faster under stress. Some people go quiet. There is no tell that means the same thing on every face. So what does baseline setting actually look like in practice? It's simpler than it sounds, and you're probably already doing a rough version of it without naming it. Early in knowing someone, or early in any conversation that matters, you pay attention. Not with suspicion, just with genuine attention to their resting state. How do they talk about ordinary, low-stakes things? What's their default pace? Do they use their hands when they describe something mundane, like what they had for lunch? Do they hold eye contact easily? Or does their gaze naturally wander even when nothing is at stake? What does their voice do when they're simply relaxed and unguarded? That's your baseline. And once you have it, the entire framework of everything in this book gets sharper, because you're no longer asking, is this behavior suspicious in general? You're asking a much more precise question. Is this behavior different from how this specific person operates when nothing is wrong? That second question is the one that actually produces signal instead of noise. Here's why this matters so much more than it sounds like it should. A deviation from baseline is data, a behavior that simply exists, evaluated with no baseline at all, is just a behavior. The nervous talker who suddenly goes flat and monotone when you ask about the money. That's a real signal, because it's a break from their established pattern. The naturally flat, monotone person who stays exactly as flat and monotone when you ask about the money. That's not a signal at all. That's just Tuesday for them. Same observable behavior, completely different meaning, and the only variable that determines which one you're looking at is whether you did the work of establishing a baseline first. This is also, uncomfortably, where a lot of false accusations come from. Someone gets nervous being questioned, not because they're guilty of anything, but because being questioned is inherently uncomfortable. And some people's baseline nervous response looks a great deal like other people's baseline guilty response. Without a real baseline for that individual, an observer ends up punishing someone for the crime of having an anxious temperament. I've watched this happen to people who are almost pathologically honest, so uncomfortable with the idea of being disbelieved that their voice shakes and their hands go still exactly the way a guilty person's would, purely out of the stress of not being trusted. The behavior looked identical to deception. The baseline, if anyone had bothered to establish one, would have shown it was identical to how this person behaved under any kind of scrutiny at all, guilty or not. So before any of the tells in the chapters ahead mean anything, the linguistic distancing, the micro-expressions, the hedging in the wrong place. They all require the same prerequisite. You have to know what normal looks like on this particular face, in this particular voice, before you can spot when normal breaks. Skip that step, and you're not detecting deception. You're just detecting difference, and difference and dishonesty are not remotely the same category of thing. There's a practical habit worth building here, and it costs nothing. In any relationship, you actually care about getting right. A new partner, a new business associate, someone you're about to trust with something real. Spend the early, low-stakes conversations simply watching, without an agenda, not interrogating, just noticing. What does this person's face do when they're telling you something completely mundane and true? Bank that. It will be the single most useful reference point you own later, when something actually matters and you need to know whether what you're looking at is a real shift or just who this person has always been. Calibration first, detection second. Everything else in this book only works in that order. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, The Body Never Got the Memo. Sit with this for a second, because it's stranger than it sounds. The human body has been communicating for a few million years longer than human language has existed. Before grammar, before words, before anyone had a name for trust, our ancestors were already reading each other through posture, through the set of a jaw, through the distance someone's body chose to keep or close. That system is ancient. It's automatic. And it is, for the most part, almost impossible to fully control on command. Now think about what that means for someone trying to deceive you. Words are rehearsable. A person can practice a story in a mirror, decide in advance which details to lead with, choose a tone that sounds appropriately casual. With enough of preparation, the verbal layer can get close to flawless, but the body is running on a completely different, much older piece of software, one that doesn't check in with the part of the brain doing the rehearsing. So while the mouth is delivering the polished version, the body is very often, quietly and stubbornly, saying something else entirely. You've felt this. Everyone has. A conversation where the words are all technically fine, reassuring even, but something in your chest doesn't relax. You can't name it. You can't point to the specific thing that's wrong. And so, because it's not evidence, you talk yourself out of it. You call it overthinking. I'd like to suggest that feeling deserves more respect than overthinking. Not as a verdict, a feeling isn't proof of anything, but as a flag worth investigating rather than dismissing. The face carries most of the useful information here, and the reason is well documented. There's a category of expression, tiny, involuntary, lasting a fraction of a second, that flashes across a face in response to a genuine emotion before the deliberate expression has time to load. They're universal across cultures, which tells you they're biological rather than learned, and they move fast enough that the person doing it usually has no idea it happened. You don't consciously catch it either, most of the time. But some part of your processing does, and that's very likely where the something felt off feeling actually comes from. The 3 worth knowing are fear, contempt, and distress. Fear shows up when someone is lying and genuinely afraid of getting caught. A flicker around the eyes and mouth that has nothing to do with the calm expression they're deliberately holding. It's a crack in the mask. Contempt is the more unsettling one, and it tends to show up in people who've been lying successfully for a long time. A specific, brief, one-sided curl at the corner of the mouth that's almost impossible to fake and almost impossible to suppress once triggered. It tells you something about how the person regards you in that particular moment. And it's rarely flattering, and distress shows up when the lie touches something the person actually has skin in. A relationship, a fear, something they're protecting, producing a tightening around the eyes or a brief compression of the mouth that contradicts whatever calm they're presenting on the surface. Below the neck, the story gets even more interesting because of a mechanism worth understanding on its own terms. When someone is working hard to manage their face, their voice, and their words simultaneously, that's an enormous amount of cognitive effort going to a small number of channels, which means the channels receiving the least conscious monitoring are the ones most likely to leak what's actually going on. And the least monitored part of the body, across nearly everyone, is the feet. I know how that sounds. Stay with it, because it's genuinely useful. Nobody thinks about their feet during a conversation, which means the feet tend to behave with a kind of honesty nobody else has. Someone who feels cornered by your questions will often, without noticing, orient their feet toward the exit, even while their face and torso are performing full engagement. Someone managing internal tension will show it in a rhythmic bounce or tap that never made it up to the parts of the body they're actually monitoring. The hands are the counterintuitive one. You'd expect liars to gesture more, to perform expressiveness, to sell it. The research says the opposite. Genuine gesture is a byproduct of real cognitive retrieval. When you're actually pulling something from memory and narrating it, your hands move along with the thought almost automatically, because the brain and body are working the same problem together. Fabrication doesn't have that luxury. Constructing a false account, monitoring your reaction to it in real time, checking for internal consistency, that's a lot of simultaneous load. And gesture is one of the first things to get starved of resources. What's left is a stillness in the hands that reads as controlled rather than natural, once you know to look for it. None of this works as a single, standalone tell, and this is the point worth remembering from every chapter in this book, not just this one. What you're looking for is congruence. Does the whole person match the story being told? Or is there a gap, a performance happening above the neck while something more honest leaks out everywhere else? That gap, once you start watching for it deliberately instead of absorbing it passively, becomes one of the more reliable instruments you'll ever own. And it sets up the next piece almost perfectly, because the body isn't the only place a person runs out of rehearsal. The other place is right after you ask the one question they didn't see coming. Chapter 4. The question they didn't rehearse. A prepared liar walks into a conversation having done real work. They've anticipated your likely questions and built responses that route around the parts of the story that don't hold up. That preparation is a genuine investment. Time, cognitive energy, rehearsal. And it's also, quietly, their biggest weakness. Because preparation, by definition, only covers what was anticipated. It can't cover what wasn't. You know what this feels like from the honest side of the table. Someone asks you a completely unexpected, oddly specific question about something real that happened to you, and you pause. You actually go looking, and either you find the answer or you say, genuinely, I don't remember that part. It costs you nothing to say. It felt effortless, because you were reaching into something real and either finding it or honestly coming up empty. Now put someone with a constructed story in that same spot. Hit them with a specific, unrehearsed question, and they don't have a memory to search. They have a structure, and structures only have detail where the builder decided to put detail. Everywhere else is scaffolding with nothing hanging on it. At that moment, they've got exactly two options, and neither one is comfortable. Option 1. Invent something on the spot. This is genuinely brutal. Cognitively, they have to generate something plausible, make sure it doesn't contradict anything already said, monitor how you're reacting to the new material, and keep managing the overall performance, all simultaneously. This is precisely why experienced questioners ask specific, concrete questions in quick sequence rather than one big open one. The cumulative demand of repeatedly generating consistent new detail wears the performance down. The vagueness creeps in. The pace shifts. Option 2, deflect. And deflection has a fingerprint, once you know what you're looking at. There's generalizing. You ask exactly where they were at 9:15 on Tuesday, and they tell you about their general evening instead. There's redirecting, introducing a new topic or detail that shifts the conversation's center of gravity away from the uncomfortable question, which works because our conversational instinct is to follow the flow rather than police it. And there's the subtlest one, answering a different question than the one you asked, with the rhythm and confidence of a real answer, while somehow never containing the specific information you actually requested. Most people don't catch this last one because we're wired to register that a response happened, not to check whether it actually addressed the question. This is where a simple habit earns its keep. Tracking. Ask something specific, hold it in mind, and actually check what comes back against what you asked for. Not aggressively. You don't need an interrogation posture for this to work. Something as calm as, "I hear you, and I appreciate that, but I want to come back to what I actually asked. Can you walk me through specifically what happened at that point?" That single move puts real pressure on a prepared account because it sends the person back to territory they thought they'd cleared. If they deflect again, that's a pattern now, and patterns are data. There's one more version of the specific question worth knowing, and it's the one that asks someone to show instead of tell. Can I see the message? Can you pull that up? Can I meet the person you mentioned? Someone with a fabricated account is deeply uncomfortable with requests for tangible evidence because a constructed story doesn't produce real artifacts, it doesn't leave footprints, and the explanations for why the evidence isn't available. The phone got wiped, the message got deleted, the person moved. Those explanations are themselves data. Watch how they accumulate. None of this requires you to be confrontational. It requires patience, specificity, and the willingness to notice when a direct question quietly didn't get a direct answer. That's the whole habit. Practiced gently, it's one of the more effective filters you'll ever build, and it sets up something people almost never expect, which is what happens the instant your question gets close enough that a story stops being the liar's best defense, and emotion becomes it instead. Chapter 5. The Weapon Called Feelings. Of everything in this book, this is the mechanism most likely already operating on you right now, in some relationship you haven't fully named it in. Once you see it, you don't get to unsee it, and it will change how you handle every difficult conversation you have from here forward. Here's the core of it. When someone is cornered, when the walls are closing in and exposure feels real, their most reliable move isn't a better story. It's redirecting your entire attention from the content of what they said to the intensity of what they're now feeling. That redirection can take a lot of shapes. Sudden anger, tears, a display of wounded vulnerability, cold, punishing silence, and the sharpest version of all, the quiet suggestion that you asking the question at all is the actual problem here. You know this one. You were calm. You asked something reasonable, and somewhere in the middle of it, the entire shape of the conversation flipped. Suddenly, you weren't the person seeking clarity. You were the aggressor. And the question, the thing you genuinely needed answered, just evaporated into the emotional weather and never came back. If that's happened to you, I want to be direct about something. That wasn't an accident. It was a mechanism. Whether or not the person doing it could have named it themselves. Psychology has a term for it: emotional flooding. And the science behind why it works is worth understanding. When someone near you goes intensely emotional, your own emotional system fires automatically. Your attention snaps away from analysis and locks onto their state. You can't fully stop this any more than you can stop flinching. Your compassion activates. Your instinct to soothe kicks in, and it competes directly with whatever tracking you were doing. The inconsistencies, the specific answer you were waiting for, all of it starts to feel secondary to the human crisis apparently happening right in front of you. And the deployment isn't random. It doesn't show up at the start of a conversation. It shows up precisely when your logical examination is getting close to a point they can't defend. When they can feel the next question coming and know they have nothing for it. The timing is the tell. Remember that line, because it's the single most useful sentence in this chapter. The emotional display doesn't arrive randomly. It arrives exactly when pressure on the story peaks. The anger version does several things at once. It reframes your reasonable question as an attack. It relocates the emotional center of gravity from your legitimate concern to their outrage at being doubted. And for anyone watching, or for the narrative of the relationship going forward, it quietly establishes that you escalated first. I've watched this exact sequence happen to a friend of mine. Calm question, sudden fury, and somehow, 20 minutes later, she was the one apologizing. She wasn't naive. The mechanism is just that well built. Tears and vulnerability work through the opposite door and land in the same place. Anger makes your questioning feel like aggression. Tears make it feel like cruelty. Someone visibly wounded by the mere suggestion they might not be trusted activates your compassion in direct competition with your need for an actual answer. How do you keep pressing someone who looks genuinely in pain? And then there's the quieter, more corrosive version. Hurt withdrawal. Going cold, going distant. Treating your question as a fundamental betrayal requiring emotional space to recover from. This is silence used as leverage. Communicating without a single word that the price of continuing to ask is the relationship itself. For most people in most relationships, that implicit cost feels too high to pay. So the question stops. The issue gets buried. The story survives another day. If any of this is landing uncomfortably close to home, hear this clearly. Backing down from a question because the emotional cost got unbearable doesn't make you weak. It makes you someone with functioning empathy, which is exactly the resource being exploited. The qualities being used against you aren't the problem. The exploitation is. Here's the distinction that cuts through the entire chapter, and it's worth carrying with you specifically. A genuinely upset, honest person can still answer your questions. Given a little patience and support, they can still produce the specific information, because they actually have it to give. Their emotional state and their ability to answer aren't in conflict. It's the person using emotion as prevention rather than expression, whose feelings and your questions seem to occupy mutually exclusive space, because for them, they are. The emotion isn't a response to being doubted. It's a tool for making sure the doubting stops. Hold on to that distinction. It's about to matter even more, because the next mechanism goes past redirecting your attention and starts, deliberately or not, redrawing the actual map of what you're allowed to believe happened. Chapter 6. When someone edits your reality. We need to go a little darker here. Not for effect, but because this mechanism can cause real, lasting damage, and recognizing it, in your own life or someone else's, might be one of the more important things in this entire book. There's a difference between someone lying about what happened and someone lying about your experience of what happened. The first is, that didn't happen. The second, far more corrosive version is, that didn't happen the way you think it did. And the fact that you think it did is itself evidence something is wrong with you. That second move has a name most people have heard and few people understand at full depth. Gaslighting. It isn't just lying. It's the sustained, systematic dismantling of your trust in your own perception. Someone telling you, consistently and with total confidence, that what you saw isn't what happened, that your memory is faulty, that your read on the situation is distorted, that the reasonable concern you're raising isn't a signal something's wrong out there. It's a signal something's wrong in here. Have you walked out of a conversation more confused than you walked in? Started certain and ended wondering if you'd misremembered? Caught yourself apologizing for having a feeling instead of just having it? If any of that's familiar, pay close attention to what's next. The effect of sustained gaslighting is measurable, and it isn't a character flaw in the person experiencing it. Human beings partly determine what's real through social confirmation. We check our perceptions against the people we trust. When someone you've invested trust in repeatedly contradicts your version of events, the sheer weight of that repetition starts to erode confidence in your own read of reality. And that erosion is exactly what the mechanism depends on. The practical signs are worth naming plainly, because naming them is the actual first step out. Apologizing for your perceptions and feelings at a frequency that doesn't feel like you. Not apologizing for a mistake. Apologizing for having seen what you saw. Doubting your memory of conversations in a way that's new, and that only shows up around one specific person. Second-guessing your own reactions instead of just having them. Feeling less capable, less stable, less like yourself, and noticing, if you trace it back, that the feeling correlates exactly with the deepening of one particular relationship. None of that is a sign something's wrong with you. It's a sign something is being done to you, and those are entirely different categories. Part of how this works is isolation, and it's usually gradual enough to be nearly invisible while it's happening. Certain friendships get quietly discouraged. The judgment of people who care about you gets subtly undermined. Situations where their version might get checked against someone else's get avoided, always for reasons that sound entirely plausible in the moment. Once that isolation is in place, once they're the only mirror left, the mirror can show you whatever it wants. The actual protection here matters more than almost anything else in this book, maintaining reality testing outside the relationship in question. Keeping people and information sources in your life who can independently confirm what you're seeing. People who knew you before. People who can say, with love, "No, I remember that conversation too. You're not making it up." If someone in your life is actively working to cut you off from those references, discouraging your friendships, casting doubt on people who care about you, suggesting the people around you are the actual problem, that pattern is one of the louder signals available that something manipulative is happening, independent of any single lie you could point to. And if any part of this chapter describes something in your own life, please don't minimize it. Don't tell yourself it's not that bad, or that you're overreacting, because that specific instinct to shrink your own experience down to nothing might not even be your own voice. It might be an echo of theirs. The bravest available move is small. Tell one person you trust what's been happening, and let them help you see clearly again. You're allowed to live in a reality that's actually yours. Take a breath. That was heavy ground. What comes next is lighter and immediately practical, because the truth doesn't just live in what someone does. It lives in the exact words they choose, whether they mean to give it away or not. Chapter 7. The words that give themselves away. Here's something almost hopeful buried in all of this. Even when someone is working hard to hide the truth, it keeps finding cracks to leak through. We've covered the body. We've covered emotion as a weapon. Now we're going somewhere more intimate than either of those. The actual words being used to build the deception are, at the same time, quietly giving it away. You don't need training for this one. You need to listen differently, not just to what someone says, but to how they've assembled it. The first pattern is distancing language, and it's one of the most consistently documented linguistic signatures of deception on record. When someone lies about their own actions, something they personally did, somewhere they personally were, they often unconsciously increase the psychological distance between themselves and the event. Not physically, grammatically. Instead of, "I put the files on the desk," you get, "The files were put on the desk." Instead of, "I called her at 8, you get, "She was called at 8. The I disappears. First person quietly gets replaced by passive construction, by a kind of narrated distance, as if some part of the speaker doesn't want to fully stand behind the claim with the full weight of "I did this." Most people doing this have no idea they're doing it. It's not strategy. It's discomfort leaking through grammar. The second pattern is hedging in the wrong place. Phrases like, "to the best of my recollection," or "I believe," or "I'm pretty sure," are completely normal parts of honest speech. We all hedge when we're genuinely uncertain. That's not the signal. The signal is hedging around a detail a person with real first-hand knowledge would state plainly. If someone says, "I believe I was home that evening," about a night they actually were home, why hedge? You were there, but say it about a night they weren't home, and the hedge suddenly makes perfect sense. It's a linguistic exit ramp, installed in advance, for a claim they don't actually have standing behind. The third pattern is my personal favorite, because once you hear it, you catch it constantly. The preemptive defense. I know this might sound weird, but I genuinely was at the gym for 3 hours. And I know you probably won't believe this, but the trainer would remember me. I can show you my gym bag if you need proof. Notice what's happening. A truthful person says, "I was at the gym," and moves on. They don't preload a defense against doubt that hasn't been expressed yet. They don't offer evidence before anyone's asked for it. The person doing all of that can feel the vulnerability in their own claim, and they're racing to armor it before you've even swung. The fourth pattern is a measurable drop in self-reference. Studies of both spoken and written deceptive communication consistently find that liars use the word "I" less often than truthful people do, across cultures and contexts. There's a reluctance to fully inhabit the claim in the first person, and it shows up as a quiet, aggregate reduction across a whole conversation rather than any single sentence. The fifth pattern is subtler than all of the others, and it's about the seam between fact and feeling. When someone truthfully describes something emotionally significant, the emotion and the facts arrive woven together, because that's how they actually experienced it. I walked in and my heart just dropped because everything was on the floor and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. One unified stream. When someone fabricates an emotional account, there's often a visible seam. The facts arrive, and then the feelings get bolted on afterward as a separate delivery. It has the texture of something assembled rather than something remembered whole. I want to be honest about something I got wrong early on with this pattern specifically. I used to think the tell was a lack of emotion, that a liar would sound flat. It's almost the opposite. The emotion is often right there, sometimes even convincingly so. What's missing is the integration. The feeling and the fact never quite become one thing. You don't need all 5 patterns showing up to take notice. One, clearly present, in a context that actually matters, is worth your attention. This is your linguistic toolkit. Distancing language, misplaced hedging, preemptive defense, reduced self-reference, and the emotion fact seam. There's a version of this that's becoming more relevant than almost anything in the previous chapters, though, because a huge share of the deception you'll actually encounter these days doesn't happen face-to-face at all. It happens in a text thread. And it turns out the written word gives away even more than the spoken one does, if you know what you're reading for. Chapter 8. The message says more than the words. Here's a strange fact worth sitting with. A lie told out loud has to survive one performance in real time. Tone, face, timing, all happening simultaneously and impossible to fully control. A lie told over text should, in theory, be easier. There's time to think, time to edit, no face to betray anything. And yet, watched carefully, a text conversation gives away more than a spoken one, not less, because it leaves a permanent, time-stamped, editable record of exactly how someone managed the story in real time, and that management itself is data. Start with latency. Most people have an unconscious sense of another person's normal response rhythm, how long they typically take to answer something ordinary. A sudden shift in that rhythm, specifically around one topic, is worth noticing. Not because a delay proves anything on its own. People get busy, people get distracted, but because a delay that shows up consistently and only around certain questions, while everything else gets answered instantly, starts to look less like circumstance and more like drafting time. Someone constructing an answer needs longer than someone retrieving one. Text just makes that gap visible in a way a live conversation never does, because in person, the gap has to be filled with something. A stall, a filler word, a pause you can at least observe happening. In text, the gap is just silence, and then, eventually, something that reads as effortless. Then there's tone drift. Most people have a texting register that's fairly stable. Level of formality, punctuation habits, how much warmth comes through. A sudden shift into unusual formality, more careful punctuation, more complete sentences than usual, right around a sensitive question, is worth noticing the same way a change in someone's spoken cadence would be. It often means the message got drafted more consciously than the rest of the conversation. People don't normally proofread a text about where they were on Tuesday. When they do, it stands out against everything around it. The deleted or edited message is its own category, and it's more common now that platforms surface it openly. Someone sends something, pulls it back within seconds, replaces it with something shorter or vaguer. This isn't proof of anything specific. Sometimes people genuinely just typo, but a pattern of edits clustering around one topic, rather than distributed randomly across a conversation the way typos actually are, tells you something about which parts of the conversation felt risky enough to warrant a second draft. And then there's the one almost everyone has felt, and almost nobody has a name for. The seen but not answered. A message read, visibly, according to whatever the platform shows you, and then met with nothing for an unusual stretch, followed eventually by an answer that doesn't actually address what you asked. That gap between seen and answered is thinking time with nowhere to hide. In person, thinking time gets covered by a dozen small physical behaviors that read as processing. In text, it just sits there, exposed, until the person decides what to send. None of this, on its own, means anything close to proof. And I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this chapter into paranoid forensic reading of every slow reply your partner ever sends you, which would be both exhausting and frequently wrong. Most delayed replies are just someone in a meeting. Most edited messages are just someone fixing a typo. The signal isn't in any single instance. It's in clustering, delays, tone shifts, and edits that consistently gather around the same specific topics, while the rest of the relationship's texting stays loose, fast, and unguarded. That clustering is what turns a series of individually meaningless data points into something worth a direct, calm conversation. There's one more thing worth saying plainly. The instinct to screenshot, compare, and analyze a text thread, the way you'd analyze evidence, can become its own problem. It can turn a relationship into a surveillance project, which corrodes trust, regardless of whether anyone in it was ever actually lying. This chapter isn't permission to do that. It's permission to trust the version of "something feels off here" that you're already noticing, and to know that the feeling has a real mechanism behind it, rather than dismissing it as you reading too much into punctuation. Which brings us back to a person who's been doing all of this: the pauses, the edits, the tone management, long enough that it's stopped being effortful and started being a way of life. Chapter 9. The person who stopped noticing they lie. Not all liars are built the same, and understanding the difference matters more than almost anything else in this book, because the tools that work on one type do almost nothing against the other. Most people lie occasionally, situationally, when the pressure gets high enough, when the truth feels too expensive in a specific moment. These occasional liars are, relative to what's coming next, fairly easy to read, because lying is genuinely stressful for them. It costs something internally, and that cost tends to show up somewhere, in the body, in the language, in the small inconsistencies that accumulate under any real pressure. Their nervous system hasn't made peace with what they're doing. There's another category, though, rarer and considerably more dangerous. And it's worth understanding not to catastrophize every person who's ever misled you, but because this category genuinely does play by different rules. These are people who've been lying long enough, consistently enough, that dishonesty has stopped being an event and become an operating system. Psychology sometimes calls them habitual or pathological liars, though I'd rather describe what they actually do than argue about the label. The mechanism is desensitization. Through years of repetition, through the slow erosion of whatever internal friction they once felt about being dishonest, the cognitive and emotional cost of lying gets driven down towards zero. The anxiety that would betray an amateur, dampened, sometimes almost entirely. The guilt that would produce visible stress, reduced to something close to background noise. The physiological arousal that gives away most people under pressure, managed to the point of near invisibility. What's left, instead of a person struggling to maintain a lie, is a system. And that system has a small number of very distinctive characteristics worth knowing by name. The first is compartmentalization. Someone operating a long-term deception maintains strict separation between the different parts of their life, because different parts of their life have been given different versions of the truth, and those versions cannot be allowed to meet. They're unusually careful, almost administratively careful, about who knows whom. They manage the boundaries between social circles the way you'd manage separate accounts, keeping the people in one context away from the people in another, not out of introversion, but because contact between the two would let someone compare notes. I want to be precise about this, because it's easy to overread. Plenty of perfectly honest people compartmentalize their social life for reasons that have nothing to do with deception. Different friend groups from different life chapters, a genuine preference for keeping work and personal life separate, simple logistics. The signal isn't compartmentalization on its own. It's a specific kind of resistance, a visible discomfort, a string of always plausible reasons. Whenever two separate parts of that person's world get close to overlapping on their own, watch for the reaction to the possibility of overlap, not the existence of separate circles. The second characteristic is manufactured consistency. Most people equate consistency with honesty. If the story stays exactly the same every time it's told, it must be true. The systematic liar knows this instinctively and works hard to exploit it, memorizing and rehearsing their account until it comes out identically every time. Same details, same order, same phrasing, almost word for word. Here's how you tell the difference between the consistency of a true story and the consistency of a memorized performance, though. Ask for something new. Request a detail that wasn't part of the original telling. A truthful person can go back into an actual memory and often surface something they hadn't mentioned before, because the real event is still there to be explored further. Someone reciting a rehearsed account, pushed past the edges of what they prepared, starts to show cracks. The confidence wavers, the smoothness falters, because there's nothing beyond the border of the script. The third characteristic is the sheer quality and quantity of their explanations. Years of practice produces years of contingency planning. Explanations ready for the moments when different parts of the story don't quite line up. Backup reasons prepared for when the evidence seems to say one thing and their account says another. In the short term, this makes them extraordinarily convincing because they always seem to have an answer. Over the longer term, though, the explanations stack, layer on layer of increasingly elaborate reasoning, in places where a simple, truthful account would need almost none. That elaborateness, complexity showing up exactly where simplicity should be sitting instead, is itself one of the more reliable tells in this entire book. The fourth characteristic is their relationship to trust itself, and it might be the most important one to actually internalize. A systematic deceiver needs your trust the way fire needs oxygen. Without it, the entire operation collapses, which means they tend to be extraordinarily skilled at generating the appearance of trustworthiness. Warm, open, generous with vulnerability, or what looks like it. Consistently present in exactly the ways that read as reliable. They know precisely what trustworthiness looks like from the outside, because they've spent years studying and producing it. But the trust they build is instrumental, a tool constructed to serve the deception, not a byproduct of actually being trustworthy. And underneath the warmth, there's a subtle but real difference in how it feels to be around, if you pay attention over enough time. Their confidence comes from the security of being convincing, not from the security of being genuine. Those two things produce almost identical surfaces and completely different undercurrents. I've known people like this, and the pattern that eventually gave it away wasn't any single lie. It was a nagging sense that never fully resolved. Everything checked out on paper. Every individual interaction was pleasant, even generous. And still, something in me never fully relaxed around them, and I couldn't articulate why for a long time. If you've ever known someone who checked every box and still left a small part of you on permanent alert, trust that. It's very possibly the exact distinction described here. The difference between someone who is genuinely trustworthy and someone who has become extremely good at performing it. None of this is a reason to become suspicious of everyone who values their privacy or keeps their social circles separate. Most people who compartmentalize, Most people who tell a consistent story, most people who are warm and generous, are simply exactly what they appear to be. What matters is the cluster. Compartmentalization paired with resistance to overlap, consistency that cracks under a genuinely novel question, explanations that multiply where they shouldn't need to, and a trust that feels performed rather than lived in. One of those alone means very little. All four together, over time, mean quite a lot. And this is where the next mechanism becomes especially relevant. Because before someone with a system like this commits to a lie that actually matters, they almost always run something smaller first. A test. Low stakes and disposable. Designed to find out exactly how much you'll let slide. Chapter 10. The test before the lie. This might be the single most useful mechanism in the whole book. Because it isn't just an interesting insight. It's an early warning system. A way to see a lie coming before it fully lands, while it's still small and cheap and hasn't cost you anything yet. Here's what actually happens, more often than most people realize. Before a significant lie gets told, the person telling it frequently runs a test first. Think of it as a trial balloon, a small, low-stakes misrepresentation released into an otherwise ordinary conversation, purely to see how you respond to it. It might be a minor distortion of something that happened, a slight exaggeration, a small claim about something trivial that isn't quite accurate. The content of the test genuinely doesn't matter. What matters entirely is what the person is watching for in your reaction to it. And what are they watching for? Everything, really. Whether you notice the inaccuracy at all, whether you say something about it, or let it slide without comment, whether you seem to prioritize accuracy over keeping the peace, or the other way around. Whether your discomfort with confrontation outweighs your commitment to getting the facts right. Whether you're the kind of person who quietly adjusts your own understanding of what happened to match what someone else just told you, or the kind of person who holds on to what you actually know and names the gap calmly, without making it a whole event. Has this happened to you? Something small, slightly off, that you noticed and let go? Maybe because correcting it felt petty. Maybe because you didn't want to create friction over something that seemed too minor to matter. I understand that impulse completely. It's a kind, socially graceful instinct, and in the vast majority of everyday situations, it's the correct one. But I want you to see what actually happened in that moment from the other side of the table. What got learned in that exact instant is that you adjust, that you accommodate, that your desire for a smooth, low-friction interaction outweighs your need for precision. And that single data point tells the other person almost everything they need to know about whether something bigger is likely to land safely with you later. Here's a version of this that might feel uncomfortably familiar. A friend tells you they arrived at a party at 8. You know, because you were there yourself, that they didn't actually show up until closer to 9:30. It's small. It doesn't functionally matter. So you let it go. You might even nod along without thinking twice about it. From your side, you were just being easygoing, not worth the awkwardness. From their side, though, you just passed a test you didn't know you were taking. You demonstrated, in a completely low-stakes context, that you'll accept a version of events that conflicts with what you personally know, rather than name the conflict out loud. And if that person ever needs you to believe something considerably bigger down the road, they now know, with reasonable confidence, that the ground has already been prepared. Now run the alternative. Your friend says 8, and you respond gently, with no edge in it at all. Oh, really? I thought it was a little later than that. I remember because I'd already been there a while before you showed up. That's the entire move. No accusation, no hostility, no interrogation. just a calm, factual observation that what they said doesn't quite match what you know. That single sentence sends a completely different signal. It tells the other person, this one notices. This one doesn't automatically reshape their own memory to match mine. This one holds on to what they actually know and says so, without aggression and without backing down either. The entire cost-benefit calculation around maintaining any future deception with you just changed, quietly, in that one small exchange. And here's what makes this genuinely usable, rather than just interesting. It costs you nothing to practice, and it doesn't require you to become the person who corrects every trivial exaggeration in every casual conversation, which would be exhausting for everyone, including you. Most small social inaccuracies, the slightly rounded-up story, the harmless exaggeration everyone tells at a party, genuinely don't matter and aren't worth flagging. What I'm describing here isn't a policy of correcting everything. It's an internal habit of noticing, even in the moments you consciously choose not to act on it, when something presented to you doesn't line up with what you actually know. And then, specifically in the relationships that matter and the situations where accuracy genuinely counts, practicing the quiet, undramatic act of naming what you see, because that habit does something beyond simply protecting you from any single liar. Over time, it builds a reputation, quiet, mostly unspoken, but deeply felt by everyone who spends real time around you, as someone who lives in reality, someone who notices, someone who can be fully trusted, not because they're suspicious or confrontational, but because they're honestly, consistently present to the actual truth of what's in front of them. And the habitual liar, encountering someone like that, tends to make a very specific, very practical calculation. They look for softer ground elsewhere. They gravitate toward people whose need for harmony will do the protective work the deception requires. You become, quietly, an unappealing target, not through vigilance or suspicion, but simply through the accumulated weight of never quite letting the small things slide unnoticed. There's a deeper layer underneath all of this worth sitting with before we move on, though, because it isn't only the liar's behavior that determines whether a deception succeeds. Sometimes the conditions for it get built from the other side of the table entirely, not through malice and not through carelessness, but through something much more human and much harder to admit to yourself. Chapter 11. The reason you wanted to believe it. Everything up to this point has been about the other person. What they do, what leaks through, what the mechanism looks like from the outside. This chapter turns the lens around, and it's going to feel less comfortable than anything we've covered so far, because it's about you, specifically about the part you may have played in your own deception, without ever intending to, without ever being careless, simply by being human. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody built into the earlier chapters. A lie doesn't succeed in a vacuum. It succeeds inside a relationship, and a relationship has two people in it. The liar builds the construction, yes. That part is entirely on them. And nothing in this chapter is about relocating blame away from someone who deliberately deceived you. But whether that construction gets accepted, examined, or waved through often depends heavily on what you were bringing to the table before the lie ever arrived. And what you were bringing, more often than people like to admit, was want. Confirmation bias is the starting point, and it's not a flaw unique to gullible people. It's a basic feature of how every human brain processes information. Once you've formed a belief about someone, your mind doesn't evaluate new information neutrally. It goes looking for things that confirm what you already believe, and it quietly discounts things that don't. If you've decided someone is trustworthy, evidence of their trustworthiness lands easily, gets remembered, gets weighted heavily. Evidence that contradicts it gets explained away. minimized, treated as the exception rather than the pattern. This isn't stupidity, it's architecture. But it means the story someone tells you about themselves doesn't land on a blank, neutral surface. It lands on top of whatever belief about them you'd already constructed, and that prior belief acts like a thumb on the scale every single time. Then there's something closer to sunk cost, except it isn't attached to money. It's attached to a version of a person you've already invested in. The longer you've known someone, the more you've built around your understanding of who they are. Shared history, mutual friends, a private mental narrative about your relationship. The more expensive it becomes to seriously entertain the idea that the narrative might be wrong. Reassessing someone you've trusted for years isn't a small mental adjustment. It's closer to demolition. It calls into question not just this one incident, but every previous incident you graded generously, every benefit of the doubt you extended, every story you told other people about how solid this relationship was. Admitting the story might be false means admitting a portion of your own past judgment might have been false too. And most people, understandably, will do a great deal of unconscious work to avoid that particular reckoning. I want to be honest about a moment from my own life here, because it's the clearest example I have, and it cost me more than I want to admit. I once extended someone the benefit of the doubt on something that, in hindsight, had almost no ambiguity in it at all. The story didn't hold together. The details didn't line up with what I already knew. And I graded it on a curve anyway. Not because I was fooled by anything particularly clever, but because the alternative, the honest read of what was actually in front of me, was simply more expensive than I was willing to pay at that moment. It would have meant an uncomfortable conversation. It would have meant admitting I'd misjudged something. It would have meant losing a version of a relationship I'd already built a fair amount of my life around. So I chose the cheaper interpretation. Not consciously, not as some deliberate act of self-deception. It felt in the moment like generosity, like giving someone the grace everyone deserves. It was actually cost avoidance, wearing generosity's clothes. This is the specific, precise distinction I want you to walk away with. Because it's easy to hear a chapter like this and slide into exactly the wrong lesson. This is not about blaming yourself for being lied to. The responsibility for a lie belongs entirely to the person who told it. Nothing here changes that math. What this chapter is actually about is noticing the mechanism by which you might have made a lie easier to tell. Not through weakness, not through stupidity, but through an entirely human aversion to the cost of seeing clearly. There's a real difference between, "It's my fault I got deceived," and "I can see the specific moment where seeing the truth would have cost me something, and I chose not to pay it." The first sentence is self-blame, and it's not useful to anyone. The second sentence is self-accountability, and it's the only version of this insight that actually makes you harder to deceive going forward. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly, maybe more honestly than feels comfortable. What would it have cost you, specifically, to see the truth clearly in the situations where you didn't? Sometimes the honest answer is nothing much. You simply didn't have the information, and no reasonable amount of scrutiny would have surfaced it. That happens, and it's not on you. But sometimes, if you're willing to actually look, the honest answer is that seeing clearly would have meant a hard conversation, a lost relationship, an admission that you'd been wrong about someone for longer than you wanted to admit, or simply the loss of a comfortable story about your own life that the truth would have disrupted. When the cost of seeing is real and high enough, most people will unconsciously discount the evidence rather than pay it. That's not a character flaw. It's an ordinary, well-documented feature of being a person who wants things to be okay. The practical move here isn't paranoid self-interrogation of every relationship you've ever had. It's a specific, occasional habit worth building. When something doesn't quite add up and you notice yourself explaining it away unusually fast, unusually smoothly, pause on that speed itself. Fast, comfortable explanations for something that should genuinely give you pause are sometimes just correct. Not everything ambiguous is sinister, and most people deserve exactly the benefit of the doubt they're getting most of the time. But sometimes that speed is the tell. Ask yourself honestly what it would cost you to take the inconsistency seriously instead of resolving it instantly. If the honest answer is quite a lot, that's worth noticing, not because it proves anything about the other person, but because it tells you something true and useful about your own vulnerability in that specific relationship. This is, I think, the hardest secret in the entire book. Harder than gaslighting. Harder than the habitual liar. Because it doesn't let you stay comfortably in the position of the person things were done to. It asks you to look at your own machinery and admit that some of it runs on the same wanting things to be okay instinct that makes every human being occasionally easy to deceive. But it's also, in a strange way, the most empowering secret here, because everything else in this book is about reading someone else. This one is about reading yourself. And that's the one piece of the whole system you actually have full control over. Now we return to the mechanism itself, because sometimes the most convincing deception isn't built from invented material at all. Sometimes it's built entirely from things that are true. Chapter 12. The Lie Made of True Things. This might be the most intellectually unsettling secret in the entire book, because it dismantles the simplest assumption most people carry into every conversation. That honesty and dishonesty are two separate bins, and your job is just to sort statements into the correct one. The most skilled deceivers in the world figured out a long time ago that this assumption is exactly what makes them so hard to catch. They figured out that truth, strategically deployed, is actually the most powerful lying tool that exists. Here's why. Someone who tells you an entirely fabricated account is, in a strange way, in a vulnerable position. Every element of their story is invented, which means every element is a potential point of failure. Anything can be checked, and if it's checked and doesn't hold up, the whole account collapses at once. But someone who builds their deception primarily out of true facts, with only a small number of critical elements altered, or more often simply left out, occupies an entirely different position. When you check the facts, most of them check out. And every fact that checks out extends a kind of credibility halo over the whole account, including the small part that isn't true. The true parts provide cover for the false parts. The result is a deception that's almost invisible to any normal fact-checking process, because fact-checking is exactly the tool this technique is built to survive. You've probably felt the specific, disorienting sensation this produces. Finding out someone misled you, and reaching for the sentence, "You lied to me," and realizing you can't quite say it, because every individual thing they told you was technically true. And yet the overall impression you were left with was completely false. You feel deceived without being able to point to a single false statement, and that gap between the feeling and the evidence is exactly where this technique lives. Here's a concrete version of it. Someone tells you about their evening. They went to a conference, had dinner with colleagues, attended the keynote, headed back toward the hotel around 10. Every single fact in that account is true. They were at the conference. They did have dinner with colleagues. They did attend the keynote. They did head back toward the hotel around 10. What never got mentioned is who else was at that dinner. What never got mentioned is the conversation that happened afterward. What never got mentioned is that heading back toward the hotel and going to their own room are not, in fact, the same claim, even though the sentence was constructed to let you assume they were. Every individual fact holds up under scrutiny. The deception lives entirely in what got left out, in the architecture of the account rather than its content, in the gap between what was said and what a complete, honest version would have included. Researchers call this selective truth, or strategic omission, or misleading with facts. The specific terminology matters less than the underlying mechanism, which is this. The most convincing false impression is one built almost entirely from genuine material. The person deploying it doesn't need to invent a false world from scratch. They just need to curate the real one with enough precision that what's missing does all the actual work. This is genuinely hard to defend against using the normal tools of honesty checking, because the instinctive question most of us ask, is what they're telling me true? Returns the wrong answer here. The answer, honestly evaluated, is yes. Yes to every part of it. And the overall impression is still completely, deliberately misleading. So the question itself has to change. Instead of asking, is this true? You start asking, is this complete? Instead of checking accuracy, you start actively considering what a full, nothing left out account of the same situation would include, and then noticing the specific shape of what's missing. This is a different kind of listening than anything else in this book asks of you. It isn't about catching falsehoods. It's about sensing gaps. Developing the habit of asking yourself in real time, what would I actually need to know to fully understand this situation? And is there something a complete account would naturally include that this one conspicuously doesn't? A few practical questions activate this kind of thinking reliably. Who else was involved that hasn't come up? What happened immediately before and after the part of the story I'm hearing? Is there a perspective on this that would look meaningfully different from the one I'm currently being given? Is there a reason the person telling me this specifically benefits from certain parts staying out of the frame? None of these questions require suspicion or hostility to ask. They require the simple, low-drama awareness that every account is told from a particular vantage point, and every vantage point involves choices about what gets foregrounded and what gets quietly left in shadow. The habit of asking what's missing, rather than only evaluating what's present, is arguably the single most effective defense in this entire book against genuinely sophisticated deception. It shifts your analysis from individual fact-checking, which selective truth is specifically engineered to survive, to whole-picture evaluation, which exposes exactly the gaps this technique depends on staying invisible. And I want to say something important before we move past this, because it would be easy to walk away from this chapter feeling permanently unsettled about every story anyone's ever told you. Developing this habit doesn't have to make you paranoid or cynical. It can make you, instead, more complete. Someone who understands that every account has more to it than what's currently being said, and who approaches that understanding with curiosity rather than suspicion. You can ask what's missing with real warmth. You can notice a gap and gently create space to explore it rather than treating its existence as an accusation. In fact, sometimes people leave things out not because they're constructing a predatory deception, but because they're afraid of your reaction, of being judged, of consequences that feel disproportionate to what actually happened. When you make it genuinely safe for someone to fill in the parts they left out, you're not only protecting yourself from being misled, you're creating the exact conditions that make deeper, more honest connection possible in the first place. That's always worth building toward, even in a book that spent this much time teaching you to notice when it isn't happening. Now we're moving into something that operates at a scale beyond any single conversation. Because when someone builds a lie significant enough to matter, they almost never do it entirely alone. They build an ecosystem around it. And the genuinely disturbing part is that most of the people inside that ecosystem have no idea they're part of it at all. Chapter 13. The Unwitting Witnesses. This next one is unsettling in a different register than gaslighting was. It isn't dark in that same visceral way. It's unsettling because it reveals something about the social architecture of deception that most people never once stop to consider. And once you see it, you understand why certain lies survive for years, sometimes decades, without ever coming apart. Here's the truth of it. When someone builds a deception of any real duration or significance, they almost never do it entirely on their own, whether they consciously realize this or not. They need a supporting cast. They need people around them who will, in various small ways, confirm pieces of their story, vouch for their character, or simply never think to ask the specific question that would unravel the whole thing. They need, in effect, an ecosystem. And the part that should genuinely give you pause is that the overwhelming majority of people recruited into that ecosystem have no idea they're playing any role in it at all. The mechanism is simple, and it's exactly this simplicity that makes it so effective. Selective information sharing. Different people get told different partial truths. One person gets one piece of the picture. Another gets a completely different piece. A third gets something else again. Each individual piece is accurate as far as it goes, genuinely, verifiably true within its own limited frame. And each person holding a piece, speaking honestly from what they actually know, becomes an unwitting corroborator of a larger narrative that isn't true at all, without ever lying themselves, without ever knowing they've been positioned that way. Has this happened to you? Have you ever vouched for someone, confirmed a detail, defended a piece of their character, backed up part of their story, only to discover later that you'd been working from a fragment, and the fragment itself was accurate while the picture it was supposedly part of was false? If that's happened to you, I want to be direct about something important. It wasn't your fault, and it wasn't a failure of judgment on your part. You weren't gullible. You weren't careless. You were honestly reporting exactly what you honestly knew. The deception was never located in anything you said. It was located entirely in what you were never told in the first place, in the deliberate gaps between your piece and everyone else's. Here's how this plays out concretely, because the abstract version doesn't quite land until you see the mechanics. Imagine someone deceiving their partner about where their time actually goes. To a colleague, they honestly say they're working late on a project, and they genuinely are in part. To a friend, they honestly say they've been stressed and need some space, and they genuinely have been. To their partner, they combine these honest fragments into something that sounds complete, working late, then grabbing a drink with a friend afterward to decompress. Every single person in this chain is telling the exact truth about the piece they personally know. The colleague can honestly confirm the late work happened. The friend can honestly confirm the need for space was real. And the partner, hearing an account that's independently corroborated by multiple real people with real knowledge, has no particular reason to doubt any of it. But the complete picture, the one that includes everything none of these individual people were ever given access to, tells a very different story. And critically, no single person in the entire ecosystem holds enough of that complete picture to see the deception on their own. Each one is holding a piece of a puzzle and seeing a perfectly reasonable, internally consistent image. The lie was never in any individual piece. It was in the assembly, in what connects the pieces together, and in what was deliberately kept just outside every single frame. This is precisely why some deceptions prove so remarkably resistant to detection. And it isn't because the person running them is some kind of criminal mastermind. It's much simpler and much more mundane than that. It's that they've distributed the truth across enough separate people, consciously or through years of instinctive habit, that no single vantage point ever contains the whole thing. So how do you actually protect yourself against a mechanism like this, without becoming suspicious of your entire social network, which would be both exhausting and deeply unfair to the vast majority of people around you who are simply sharing information honestly? The protection here is subtler than vigilance. It lies in understanding, as a baseline assumption, that any single person in any network only ever has access to their particular slice of the picture, and that the full picture, when it actually matters, needs to be deliberately assembled rather than casually assumed. In practice, this looks like a willingness, when something feels slightly off, to gently compare notes. Not in an accusatory way, not in a way that puts anyone on the spot or manufactures drama out of nothing, just as a natural, low-key act of curiosity, mentioning to one person what another person said in an ordinary conversational way, and simply noticing whether the accounts line up cleanly or whether there's a subtle gap, a small divergence that suggests two people might be working from two slightly different scripts. It also means paying attention to how someone behaves around the possibility of their different social worlds actually mixing. Someone relying on compartmentalized information sharing tends to be visibly uncomfortable when different parts of their ecosystem come into contact with each other. They resist situations where people from separate contexts might end up comparing notes. They always have reasons, plausible, reasonable-sounding reasons, for why certain people shouldn't meet or certain conversations shouldn't happen in front of certain other people. That specific that careful ongoing management of who talks to whom isn't proof of anything by itself, but it's a signal worth noting and worth holding alongside everything else you've already learned to watch for. I want to close this chapter with something that comes from genuine care rather than alarm, because this particular secret can feel unusually heavy if you sit with it too long. The existence of this mechanism doesn't mean you should stop trusting the people around you, and it doesn't mean every social circle is secretly a web of coordinated deception. It almost never is. Most people, in the overwhelming majority of situations, are sharing information completely honestly, with nothing hidden and nothing to gain from omission. What this chapter actually gives you isn't suspicion. It's a specific kind of awareness. The awareness that no single source, however trusted, ever hands you the complete picture of anything on its own. And that the quiet, respectful habit of assembling a fuller picture from multiple honest perspectives, when something genuinely calls for it, isn't paranoia at all. It's simply wisdom, applied carefully and used sparingly, exactly where it's actually needed. Now we're going somewhere genuinely fascinating, because the next secret takes us inside the mind of the person doing the deceiving in a way nothing else in this book quite manages. It asks a deceptively simple question with a profoundly strange answer. What actually happens psychologically to a person who lives inside their own fabrication long enough for the fabrication to stop feeling like one? Chapter 14. When the liar starts believing it. This is, I think, the most psychologically complex territory in the entire book, and it's the chapter most likely to genuinely change how you understand the dishonest people already in your life. Not by excusing what they've done, but by making the picture more complete than pure anger ever could. Here's the core of it. Lies, particularly the significant ones, particularly the ones maintained over months or years, rather than told once and left behind, do not stay external to the person telling them. They don't function like a mask that gets taken off cleanly at the end of the day and set aside. Over time, through mechanisms psychology has documented with real precision, the lie begins to merge at least partially, with the liar's own sense of what actually happened. And that changes almost everything about how you should interpret their behavior when confronted. The first mechanism is rehearsal, and it's more literal than the word usually implies. Every time someone tells their false account, out loud, or even just mentally reviewing it in preparation for a conversation that might challenge it, they're strengthening the same neural pathways associated with that account that get strengthened by genuine memory retrieval. This isn't a metaphor. Memory research has shown repeatedly that the repeated rehearsal of any event, whether it actually happened or was entirely invented, increases its subjective feeling of familiarity and realness in the mind of the person doing the rehearsing. Someone who's told their false account dozens or hundreds of times develops a relationship with that account that increasingly resembles the relationship any of us have with our genuine memories. It starts to feel familiar. It starts to feel real. Not because it is, but because the brain doesn't perfectly distinguish between "I remember this because it happened" and "I remember this because I've rehearsed it so many times it grew its own weight." You've probably had a small, harmless version of this yourself, told a true story about your own life so many times that you're no longer entirely sure whether you're remembering the original event or remembering the last time you told the story about it. Most people have felt that specific blur with something that actually happened. Now stretch that same mechanism across a false story, told and internally rehearsed hundreds of times over years, and the boundary between construction and memory doesn't disappear, but it blurs considerably more than most people would guess. The second mechanism is investment through defense. Every time someone protects their false account against a challenge, generating the emotional energy and the logical arguments necessary to preserve it against doubt, they're investing further in it, psychologically, whether they mean to or not. Human beings have a well-documented tendency to believe more strongly in things they've had to fight for. The lie stops being something merely stated and becomes something defended, something sacrificed for, something with entire personal narratives accumulated around it over time. And things people fight for, things they've taken real risk for, start to feel true in a way that things simply received rarely do. Each successful defense of the story adds another layer of genuine psychological ownership. What began as something they were carrying starts, gradually, to become something they're actually living inside of. The third mechanism is the one I find most remarkable, and honestly the most quietly tragic. What's sometimes called belief echo. In sustained, long-term deception, the consistent performance of a false account can begin to generate genuine, if partial, belief in that account within the mind of the person performing it. The liar starts to partially believe their own lie. Not completely, not with the simple, unquestioned certainty of someone who actually lived the real event, but with a blurred, confused, partial conviction that makes it genuinely difficult for them, in certain moments, to locate exactly where the truth ends and the fabrication begins. This isn't a conscious decision to believe something false. It's the psychological consequence of maintaining a fiction with enough consistency, enough emotional investment, and enough sustained rehearsal that the two things have started, at the edges, to merge. This has a practical implication that matters enormously if you want to navigate deception with real sophistication rather than just a checklist of tells. It means some liars, when confronted, will show genuine distress, not performed, not the tactical, emotional flooding covered several chapters back, but real, felt, heartfelt distress. Because from somewhere inside their own blurred psychology, the account they're defending has come to feel, in important ways, true to them. They aren't performing innocence in that moment. They're experiencing something that closely resembles the actual feeling of being falsely accused, even though the accusation happens to be entirely accurate. This is deeply confusing for the person on the receiving end, because we're trained correctly in most ordinary circumstances to read genuine emotional distress as evidence of honesty. If they're that upset, surely they must be telling the truth. Not necessarily. Not when you're dealing with someone whose relationship with truth has become this compromised through the mechanisms just described. Their emotional response to being challenged is no longer a reliable indicator of the accuracy of their account. It's an indicator of something else entirely, the depth of their own psychological entanglement with their fabrication. Does this change how you should feel about someone like this? I think it should, honestly, not toward excusing the damage they've caused, which remains entirely real and entirely theirs to own, but toward a more complete understanding of what sustained deception actually costs the person doing it. Someone who has lied long enough and deeply enough that they can no longer cleanly distinguish their own truth from their own fiction hasn't won anything. They've lost something fundamental: their own clarity, their own uncomplicated relationship with reality, their own simple ability to know with confidence what actually happened versus what they made up somewhere along the way. That isn't power. It's a specific, quiet kind of prison, and while it never excuses the harm caused to the people around them, understanding it gives you something anger alone never can. Because when you can see the entire system, not just what the deception is doing to you, but what it's doing to the person maintaining it, you're operating with a completeness of vision that puts you in a genuinely different position. You're not simply reacting anymore. You're understanding. And in the domain of human psychology, understanding is always the higher ground, even when, especially when, it doesn't make the situation any less painful to sit with. Chapter 15. The Silence They Cannot Survive. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground together at this point. You understand how a fabricated story is architecturally different from a genuine memory. You understand what a face does in the fraction of a second before it composes itself back into something deliberate, and what the hands and feet do when nobody's monitoring them closely enough. You understand what a specific, unrehearsed question does to someone who's constructed rather than remembered. You understand how emotion gets weaponized at exactly the moment your questions get too close, and how reality itself can be quietly redrawn by someone patient enough to do it slowly. You understand the words that give themselves away: the vanishing I, the misplaced hedge, the defense mounted before anyone's attacked. You understand what a text message reveals that a voice never could. You understand the person who's turned deception into infrastructure, and the small test they run before committing to anything that actually matters. You understand your own part in it, the specific, human cost of seeing clearly, and the moments you may have chosen not to pay it. You understand how truth itself gets weaponized, how an entire innocent network can unknowingly corroborate a lie none of them can see the whole of, and what happens, psychologically, to someone who's lived inside their own fabrication, long enough for the fabrication to start feeling real to them too. That's an extraordinary amount of machinery. But this next mechanism might be the simplest and, in its own quiet way, the most powerful thing in the entire book, because it requires none of it. No training, no specialized knowledge, no clever question, no analytical framework, no careful listening for a linguistic pattern. It requires exactly one thing: your willingness to be quiet. Here's what silence actually does to someone in the middle of lying to you. When you respond to a claim with a question, the person you're questioning knows precisely what to do next. They have a direction to move in. They have an answer prepared, a deflection ready to deploy, an emotion they can reach for if the pressure gets too specific. Your question hands them a cue, and they respond to that cue with whatever they've already got loaded. The whole interaction stays manageable because it follows a predictable rhythm they can navigate almost automatically. You ask, they answer. You push, they defend. The conversation has a shape they know how to move through. But when you respond to something with silence instead, genuine, unhurried, unfilled silence, the entire structure changes underneath them. Silence removes the cue. It strips away the predictable rhythm entirely. It takes away the one piece of information a dishonest person actually needs to manage the interaction. Some read on what you're currently thinking. When you simply look at someone, attentively, calmly, without rushing to fill the space with your next question or your next thought, they suddenly have no idea what's happening on your side of the conversation. They don't know if you believe them. They don't know if you've already caught the lie and are simply waiting, patiently, to see what they'll do with the space you've left open. They don't know what happens next, and that specific kind of not knowing about what's occurring inside the mind of the person supposedly receiving their story is deeply and viscerally destabilizing in a way that almost nothing else in this book replicates. You felt a small version of this yourself, even in completely honest exchanges. Someone says something to you, and instead of responding right away, you simply look at them and don't say anything for a beat longer than feels comfortable. Even when you're telling the complete, unvarnished truth, there's something about that silence that makes your nervous system sit up. We're social creatures, wired at a very deep level to seek feedback, to read reactions, to constantly calibrate against whatever we're getting back from the person across from us. When that feedback simply stops arriving, something in most people scrambles, at least a little, to fill the void that's opened up. Now multiply that ordinary discomfort by the weight of an actual lie sitting underneath it. Multiply it by whatever's happening somewhere in that person's nervous system, even if they'd never consciously admit it to themselves, that registers at some level that what they just said wasn't true. Silence in that specific context isn't just mildly uncomfortable. It becomes something close to unbearable. And when something becomes unbearable, people fill it. Not because they have more convincing material to add. Not because they genuinely want to keep talking. They fill it because the silence itself starts to feel dangerous. And talking, any talking, feels like doing something. It feels like clawing back a measure of control over an interaction that just slipped, somewhat suddenly, out of their grasp. And here's where this becomes genuinely useful to you, practically, in real conversations. The things a person says when they're filling your silence are frequently the most revealing things they say in the entire exchange. They add detail they hadn't planned on adding. They elaborate in directions they clearly hadn't prepared for in advance. They circle back to something they already said and repeat it, but with small variations. And those variations, the tiny gaps between the first telling and the second, expose the difference between a rehearsed account and an actual memory, because rehearsed accounts tend to repeat identically, while genuine ones shift slightly in the retelling. Sometimes they'll ask you outright what you're thinking, which is itself an unusually revealing move, because a truthful person who's already said what they had to say generally doesn't need to anxiously monitor your reaction for signs the performance is landing. It's the person managing a fabrication who needs, urgently, to know whether it's working. Each of these behaviors, the unsolicited extra detail, the unplanned elaboration, the anxious repetition, the urgent request for your reaction, is a gift you didn't have to ask for. It's information the other person never intended to hand you, generated entirely by the pressure of a silence you simply chose not to fill. Learning to be genuinely, comfortably quiet after someone has said something you're not fully sure about is a practice that pays back far more than it costs, and it costs you almost nothing to start doing. You don't need anything clever prepared. You don't need your next question ready and waiting. You just need to be willing to sit inside the quiet for a moment longer than feels entirely natural, to let the space stay open a little past the point of comfort, communicating, without a single word, that you're actually thinking carefully about what you just heard, rather than simply accepting it and moving forward. For someone telling you the truth, your silence isn't a problem at all. They said what they said. They know it's accurate. They can wait, comfortably, for whatever comes next, because nothing about the silence threatens them. For someone who isn't telling you the truth, that same silence becomes one of the more uncomfortable things they'll encounter in the entire conversation. And in their discomfort, quietly and without you having to do anything more than simply not speak, sits your clarity. Chapter 16. Why People Lie to You at All. We've spent this entire book examining how people lie. The architecture of a fabricated story. The tells the body can't quite suppress. The specific questions that create pressure a rehearsed account can't absorb. The way emotion gets weaponized right when your scrutiny gets too close. The way reality itself can be quietly redrawn. The words that betray a construction even when the construction is otherwise flawless. What a text thread reveals that a voice can't. The systems a habitual deceiver builds. The small tests run before the big lie ever arrives. Your own part in making certain lies easier to tell. The way truth itself gets weaponized. The innocent network that unknowingly corroborates a lie none of them can see whole. What happens to someone who's lived inside their own fabrication long enough for it to start feeling real, and the specific quiet pressure of simply refusing to fill a silence? That's the how, covered from nearly every angle this book has access to. There's one piece left, and it matters as much as everything else combined, maybe more, because it's not about how, it's about why. Understanding why someone lies to you tells you something the mechanics never can. Not just about them, but about the actual relationship you're standing inside, and what, if anything, it would take to change it. People don't lie randomly. They lie for reasons that are consistent, psychologically coherent, and deeply human, even when the lies themselves cause real damage. Those reasons sort, broadly, into 3 categories, and each one carries completely different implications for how you should respond, which is exactly why collapsing them into one undifferentiated bucket called lying is a mistake. The 3 require 3 different responses, and using the wrong one wastes your effort at best and deepens the damage at worst. The first category is protective lying, lying to avoid consequences. This is the most common form of deception on earth, and it spans an enormous range of moral weight. At one end sits a child insisting they didn't eat the last of something, purely out of fear of being scolded. At the other end sits someone destroying records to avoid prosecution. In between is nearly every ordinary human moment where someone decided the truth felt too expensive to hand over. What does protective lying tell you about the relationship it happened inside? Something worth taking seriously. The person lying to you doesn't believe, or has learned, sometimes through real experience, not to believe, that the truth will be received in a way they can survive. They think the honest answer brings a response worse than the risk of getting caught in a lie. Whether that belief is accurate is the actual question worth sitting with. Sometimes the relationship genuinely isn't safe for honesty, and the fear is earned. Sometimes it is safe, and the person has simply never been given a real chance to discover that, because nobody ever tested it with something that actually mattered. The second category is relational lying. Lying to preserve connection. People lie to partners about things that feel threatening to the relationship itself. They lie to friends about how they actually feel. They lie to family about who they actually are. Because the truth, or what they believe the truth to be about themselves, feels incompatible with the love and belonging they're afraid of losing. This is often the most heartbreaking category of the three, because it rarely comes from malice or indifference. It comes from fear. Specifically, the fear that being fully known means being fully rejected, and the quiet, aching belief that the only way to stay inside the circle is to keep certain parts of yourself permanently hidden from it. Has someone ever lied to you? Not to hurt you, but because they were genuinely terrified of losing you. You can feel the difference between that and the other categories, even before you can articulate why. It doesn't make the lie acceptable. It doesn't erase whatever damage it caused. But it changes the landscape of what's actually possible between the two of you, if both people are willing to look honestly at what's underneath it. What relational lying tells you is that the person doesn't feel safe enough, yet, to be fully known by you. And that specific lack of safety is worth examining directly, because sometimes the responsibility for it sits with them. Sometimes it sits with you, and sometimes it lives in the space between, in unspoken rules and unexamined assumptions neither of you ever actually agreed to, but both of you have been quietly following anyway. The third category is predatory lying. Lying to take something from you. This is the one with no ambiguity attached to it and nothing redemptive underneath. Someone who lies specifically to gain your trust so they can extract something from it. Your money, your affection, your labor, your compliance, your vulnerability. This is deception functioning as violation plainly. And what it tells you about the relationship is stark. There isn't one. You're in a transaction, and you're the resource being harvested inside it. Predatory lying doesn't respond to compassion. It doesn't respond to understanding, patience, or the creation of a safer emotional space, because its underlying motivation isn't fear, and it isn't love, and it isn't self-protection in any recognizable human form. It's appetite. An appetite without conscience doesn't soften because you were kind to it. It feeds regardless. Knowing which of these three categories you're actually dealing with matters enormously because it determines what the correct response even looks like. Protective lying might genuinely respond to the deliberate creation of a safer environment, where truth starts to feel survivable instead of costly. Relational lying might respond to a deepening of real, unconditional acceptance, patiently offered over time. Predatory lying responds to none of that. It responds to exactly one thing, the boundary you're actually willing to enforce, and nothing softer than that will register at all. Here's the final piece, the one that ties everything in this book together. A life genuinely built on deception is, underneath whatever it gains, a life of profound isolation. Whatever the liar wins through their dishonesty, they pay for it with the one thing dishonesty can never purchase: the possibility of real connection. Because real connection requires being known fully without editing, without a constructed version standing in for the actual person. Someone who can't allow themselves to be known that way, who's permanently managing a version of reality instead of simply living inside the true one, forfeits the single thing that would make all the protection and advantage of successful deception worth anything at all in the end. The experience of being seen completely and being cared for anyway. Understanding the psychology of deception, at its deepest level, is really understanding the psychology of human fear. Fear of consequences, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of what would happen if the whole unedited truth were actually known. That understanding doesn't excuse the damage a lie causes. Nothing in this book has argued that it should, but it offers something anger alone never quite manages to give you: the ability to see a lie clearly, name it without cruelty, protect yourself without losing your own humanity in the process, and hold on to the recognition that someone who can't tell you the truth is, in some real sense, still someone who hasn't yet learned how to feel safe in the world. That knowledge doesn't make you responsible for fixing them, but it makes you something more useful than a victim of the situation. It makes you someone who actually understands it. And understanding, in the end, isn't just knowledge. It's the beginning of every relationship that's ever going to be real. You started this book statistically, almost certain to have been lied to recently, and roughly coin flip odds of ever catching it. That's not where you are now. You know what a rehearsed story sounds like against a genuine memory, and you know that knowing requires a real baseline first, not a universal checklist. You know what the body does when the mouth is managing something the body isn't in on. You know what silence costs someone who's constructed rather than remembered, and what it costs nothing at all to someone who simply told you the truth. You know your own part in it, the specific human cost of seeing clearly, and the moments it's genuinely cheaper not to pay it. You know that the most dangerous deceptions are sometimes built entirely from true things, and that the right question was never, "Is this true?" but "Is this complete?" None of this was ever supposed to make you suspicious of the people in your life. If it made you that, something in how you carried it went sideways. The actual goal was narrower and harder and considerably more valuable. Become someone who is extraordinarily difficult to deceive without losing an ounce of the warmth that makes you worth deceiving in the first place. Stay open. Stay generous with the benefit of the doubt most of the time. With most people, because most people, most of the time, are exactly who they say they are. Just stop being an easy grade for the small percentage who aren't. Trust your gut, but check it against what's actually in front of you. Ask the questions that don't have rehearsed answers waiting for them. And when something doesn't add up, and the urge to fill the silence with reassurance gets loud, don't. Let it sit. What comes next will tell you almost everything you need to know.